Hi everybody, welcome to the video lecture for Monday, March 30th. If you've already noticed, this video will take a bit of a different approach. I noticed that a lot of you guys seem to be struggling with how to do the proofs, which I think is totally fine considering the distance education and the pace. And the fact that everything I've shown you so far has been, in the form of a PowerPoint or something like that. Normally we would be doing this almost entirely on the board and, on paper. I don't expect you to go out and, hotkey all the logical operators to your keyboard so that you can do them in Microsoft Word. I would assume that it's easiest for you to do them on paper. And honestly, it's easiest for me to do them on paper. So I wanted to spend today's lecture doing some of those proofs on paper to show, the fundamental way that we do proofs is not different when we do them on paper. But I think walking through it step by step on a piece of paper might be helpful for you when you practice these problems yourself. So basically what I'm going to do for this whole video is do some more of the practice problems from the first 4 exercises. And yeah, just pretty much show you what I'm doing, talk about some of the concepts, maybe try to bring some other things out. So consider this lecture as, basically supplemental to what was on Friday. I thought that by this time we would move on to the next rules, but I think it's good to take another day and really make sure that you guys are ironing this content out. So we'll introduce the next 4 rules on Wednesday. So take today and then Tuesday to do some practice problems, see if you get the hang of it. And then if you aren't, send me an email or post about it in the discussion board. One thing I'm deciding that I'm going to try to do 2 hours of office hours every week. So I will be holding a Microsoft Teams meeting, what will be Tuesday, March, what, is there 31 days in March? Yeah, on Tuesday, March 31st. So yeah, I'll be chilling in there from noon to 1. You can come in and say hi, ask some questions, maybe we'll do some problems. If not, feel free to do what you do. I also plan on doing the same thing, office hours, on Thursday as normal. So yeah, with that being said, let's jump right into it. So when you're doing proofs at home and you're doing these practice problems, it's important to have, a sheet of paper. And then also, we've got the practice problems themselves. Again, this is the first 4 exercises on Blackboard. And then also, we've got our implication rules. We only know the first 4 at the moment, but whether that's in the form of like notes or something like that, at this stage I don't expect you to have them memorized. I have them memorized, so I won't be, referring to them often, but just make sure you have them close. So, as I recall from Friday's PowerPoint, we did all of the problems through 7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with number 8. So we see that's what we got, and then our first step is, when we're doing these on paper, is just to copy the problem down exactly as it appears. The nice thing about this format is that it gives you the problem exactly as it would be set up in a proof. So I'm just going to copy all of that down. P, then Q. R, then S. And then our last premise is R. And then I'll skip over to the side just as it is on the practice problem, and that's our conclusion. So that means 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all of our premises. If you want, our book doesn't do this, but I think I mentioned it when I first introduced the proofs. If it helps you keep track of things, label the premises as such, and then also, R is a premise. Even though we put the conclusion right here, R is still premise in this problem. So that's exactly how you set that up. We have the 3-column structure with our number column. We've got our symbols, and then we've got our justification. So if we just set that up, we're in good shape. We're now ready to make some inferences. So I see that our conclusion is not P, and we have a P in here. Based on my rules, that tells me that modus tollens might be able to get me my my conclusion. But at this stage, I think it's best to just sort of take the inferences that you can get and sort of see what happens. So a good thing to look for when you're doing proofs is to look for these simple statements. Simple statements are prime candidates for modus ponens and modus tollens. Modus ponens and modus tollens are pretty much our bread and butter. They will never go away, they will always be relevant, and they're always really useful for generating inferences. So I see that we have this conditional, if R then S, and then we have R. So because I have those two on their own line, I know that I can infer S. How? Via modus ponens on 3 and 4. So I'll draw this in pink. Modus ponens is if P then Q, P therefore Q. So in this instance, R is our little p, big S is our little q. So we have that conditional on its own line, and then we have our little p on its own line. So that allows us to infer our little q. That's how we pointed out the substitution instance of modus ponens. All right, so now we got S, and then I'm going to put a mark right here just to show that I've worked on 3 and 4. I've made an inference using 3 and 4. You can use a line multiple times to make your inferences, and as the proofs get more complex, you probably will have to. But it's always useful to mark the ones that you've worked on, because usually you're going to have to work on all of the lines. As I've said before, think of these as a puzzle. And especially beginner puzzles, if you've ever done them, whether they be like puzzle games or even like a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. It's rare for a puzzle creator to give you more pieces than you need. Usually that's a sort of challenge that only comes at the later stages. It's the same sort of thing here. Chances are good that you're going to need to use every single line. So keeping track of the ones that you haven't used yet is going to be really good. So with that in mind, I see on number 1 we have a conditional with S as our antecedent. And on number 5 we just pulled down S as part of our inference. So that tells me that 1 and 5 constitute an instance of modus ponens, because we have if S then not Q, and we have S. That tells us we're allowed to infer not Q. How? Via modus ponens on 1 and 5. And then I'll make a mark here because we worked on it. Same thing with 5. So the only lines we haven't worked on are 2 and 6. So our first thought should be, what can we do with those? If we can't do anything with those, then we'll, look at the ones we've already worked on. But if we see 2 and 6 constitute an instance of modus tollens. Why? Because 2 is a conditional, and then 6 is the negation of the consequent. Modus tollens, if you remember, is a conditional plus the negation of the consequent, which allows you to pull down the negation, the antecedent. So by saying that, I'm allowed to pull down not P. Why? Because of modus tollens on 2 and 6. Cool. So now I've worked on everything except for, my latest inference 7, and I see that 7 is exactly the same as my conclusion, which means that I'm done. I've successfully proved that you can infer or derive our conclusion from these base premises. And that's all we're trying to do in a proof. So if you do that, it's completely perfect. So yeah. Oh yeah, I should put down that this was number 8. Alright, so with that done, let's do another. Let's do number 9. Once again, I will look straight at... bless you. I'll look straight at my practice problems, and I'll just copy it straight down as it appears. So our first one, either R or S. 2 is the negation of the disjunction P or Q. 3 R, then P or Q. And our last premise, Q or R. And then just to make these explicit, I'll label all of these as premises. And then right after our last premise is labeled, I will put our conclusion. Make that wedgier. Alright, so that's our problem. We've got it all down. Now what we're going to do is pretty much look through it and see what inferences we can make. Alright, so looking at it, my eye goes to numbers 2 and numbers 3. So 3 we have a conditional, and notice the consequent here. Either P or Q. In 2 we have the negation of that consequent. That tells us that that's an instance of modus tollens, and we could then bring down not R because of modus tollens on 2 and 3. Just to sort of make that explicit, I'm going to pull it out and I'll do it over here. So line 3 is if R, then P or Q. And then line 2 is the negation of P or Q. And then from that, I derived line 5, which is not R. So see how this construction is, just an instance of modus tollens, where, R is our little p, but then our little q is this whole disjunction. So then in 2, we had the negation of q, because that's what q is in this instance. And then for our conclusion, we have the negation of p, because for this instance, little p is big R. So that's what allows us to do modus tollens. That's how we are able to know what we can pull out of that, and that being not R. So, back to the problem. I derived not R, but that's not our conclusion, so we still got to keep going. So I'm going to put a mark here just to show that we worked on it. I'm going to pull this clip out because I'm worried about my keyboard. Push the keyboard back. So we've got not R. What can we do with it? It doesn't look like we can do anything with 4 and not R. But look at number 1. We have a disjunction, and then we have the negation of one of its disjuncts. That's a primo candidate for a disjunctive syllogism. 1 and 5. So if we have a disjunction and the negation of one of the disjuncts, we're allowed to bring down the other disjunct, which will be S. Why? Because ds is either P or Q. In this case, we have not P, therefore Q. Cool. So we're allowed to bring down S. That means we worked on that, we worked on that. The only things we haven't worked on are 4 and 6. So our eyes should be looking to those to see if there's any inferences we can make. And 1 jumps out at me instantly. 4, we have a conditional with S as the antecedent. And 6, we have S. That tells us we can do modus ponens. So that allows us to bring down the consequent of that conditional. We knew that via modus ponens on 4 and 6. So now I'll cross those off. And we just derived our conclusion. So that means we're done. We successfully proved that this disjunction can be inferred from these 4 premises. So well done. All right. Now let's move on to the next one. So this will be problem 10. Again, I'm just copying this from the sheet. And then I'll label my premises just so I am explicit about what they are. And then beside my last premise, I'll put the conclusion. It's just to make it tidy. All right, so I got it down. Now let's solve some problems. So 2 inferences jump out to me. You know, if you only see one, then do it. Again, there can be multiple ways to do a proof, and the order that you make the inferences does not matter at all, so long as they're good, valid inferences. So the first one I see is here at 1 and 3. So in 1 we have a disjunction, 3 we have the negation of one of those disjuncts. So that's a candidate for disjunctive syllogism. So we have not P, which tells us we're allowed to bring down big Q. The disjunctive syllogism on 1 and 3, and then I'll put a mark here to show that we've worked on those. All right, so now once again I see 2 inferences, but we'll do the simplest one, which is, so we just derived Q, and Q is the antecedent of this conditional. Anytime you have a statement that happens to be the antecedent of a conditional, go ahead and do modus ponens. Do it every time. You have very little to lose. So I see we have if Q then not R, and we have Q via modus ponens, we are allowed to infer not R. And I'll put a mark here. So the only ones we haven't worked on are 4 and 6, and once again, we have an antecedent for one of our conditionals. So via modus ponens again, that tells us we can do not S via modus ponens on 4 and 6. So now we worked on everything except for our last inference, and that happens to be our conclusion, so we know that we're done. So that's one way to complete this proof.
Yay.
Thank you. She's so supportive. It's lovely. But there was one inference in here that maybe you saw that I didn't do. So I want to sort of show an alternate version of what you could do. And again, which way you do the proof does not matter so long as your inferences are correct. There could be many ways to imply the conclusion from the premises, and that's perfectly okay. So, over here I'll put our sort of alternate timeline. And look at number 2 and number 4. we have a conditional and we have another conditional. And notice that the consequent of this conditional is the antecedent of this conditional. Well, that should remind us of our last rule, hypothetical syllogism, which says if P then Q and if Q then R, you can smush the conditionals together to get if P then R. Well, that applies to 2 and 4. They have not R in common. So, via hypothetical syllogism, we can smush them together, cut out the not R's that they share in common, and just call it if Q, then not S. And I'll just make this. So, yeah, that's our derivation, and we did that via hypothetical syllogism on 2 and 4. So with this, I'll use my wallet. Yeah. Oh, you guys haven't been able to see the alternative. Oops. But yeah, that's what we were able to pull down, and I just put it over here because this is another way that the proof could have been done. So we're just going to do that. Keeping lines 1 through 4 exactly the same because those were our premises. So now we have this guy, and we worked on 2 and 4 in this instance. So now what can we do? Well, we can once again do the disjunctive syllogism on 1 and 3, and that will allow us to bring down Q. And then now that we have Q, we can use Q with our derivation at number 5 and get not R, because we have a conditional and then the antecedent of that conditional. That tells us modus ponens can be done. So now we have not R. And now, if we look at 4 and 7, we can do modus ponens there and get not S. So that also gave us not S. So that was just an alternate means of doing this problem with the hypothetical syllogism. As we see, it took one more step, which is fine. Either one of these ways of solving the problem is totally okay. With these problems, try not to confuse yourself as to which way is best or which way, is most efficient. None of that will matter for the grade. Just do what you're most comfortable with, and do what you're most confident with. Chances are, if you're doing this confidently, you're going to find the right answer one way or another. So either one of these is totally good. All right, now let's do another. I'm going to move this over here. Okay. All right. Let's do number 11. That's if P, then R, not S, P or Q, R, then S. Alright, so those are our premises. I will label them as such. And then that's our conclusion. Alright. So what do we see here? My eyes first go to this not S because it's a negated simple statement. That tells us that there's a prime candidate for either disjunctive syllogism or maybe a modus tollens, sometimes a modus ponens. When you're trying to figure out what to attack first or what to look at first, look to the simple statements. So I see two inferences we can make here. We could do a hypothetical syllogism on 1 and 4, but because I talked about the simple statements. Let's see what we can do with 2. Well, on 2 and 4, we can do modus tollens. Do we see that? We have the conditional here, and then we have the negation of its consequent, which is modus tollens. So that would give us not R. Be a modus tollens on 2 and 4. I'll put some marks here just to show that we worked on that. So now we have not R. Can't do anything with 3 because we have, we don't have the negation of P, we don't have the negation of Q. But we can do something with 1. 1 is a conditional if P then R, and then we just derive the negation of that consequent. So once again, we can do modus tollens on 1 and 5 to bring down not P. I'll put marks there. All right, so now we haven't worked on 3, and we just derived not P. Well, like we said before, we needed the negation of one of these disjuncts in order to do anything with it, and now we have it. So that tells us that 3 and 6, we can do a disjunctive syllogism to bring down Q. Because we have the disjunction, and then we have the negation of one of the disjuncts. So disjunctive syllogism on 3 and 6, and that brings down Q. Q is our conclusion, so we're done. That's all we needed to do. All right. So now let's do one more. I'll make this box just to show, because I don't want to flip the page. All right. Let's do 12. Copy that over, P and S, not R. Alright, this is getting a bit more complicated. Oh, sorry y'all. Doing this with my iPad, and it's the camera is a little oddly oriented. Alright, so we have 4 premises, and then our conclusion is going to be not Q. Alright. So, this one looks a bit harder, but I think our first eye should be on line 2 because we have a negated simple statement there. But what can we do with it? Well, it looks like we can't do anything with it. Can't do anything with 1. I mean, mostly because 1 is a negated conjunction, and we don't have any rules for that. Can't do anything with 3. I mean, we have a not R in here, or sorry, we have an R in here, but rules only work on the main operator. So, if Q then R on a line by itself, we could do a modus tollens on it, but because it's embedded in all these parentheses, we can't touch it. And then on line 4, we can't do anything because there's no R's in there. So it looks like, on the face of it, we can't do anything with line 2 at this stage. But notice this. Look at line 4. Notice our consequent. Both P and S. And then look at line 1. We have the negation of both P and S. So we have a conditional, and then we have the negation of its consequent right up here. That tells us we can do modus tollens on 4 and 1. And what will that give us? That will give us not P. And then I'll put marks here just to show that we worked on them. So we brought down not P, and that opens up new possibilities. If you're doing a proof and you're doing it well and you're doing it correctly, each inference you make will open up a new move that you can make. It'll sort of, and once you get the hang of it, there will be almost a rhythm of it where you can see one step ahead. That's really where you want to get with these sorts of things. So 3 and 5, I see, is an instance of modus ponens. Why? Because we have this conditional, and then we have the antecedent right here. Even though it's negated, they're still the same. That's all we need. So that's an instance of modus ponens. 3 and 5. So that means I'm going to bring down this whole thing and put it on its own line. So P or Q, if Q then R. And we have to keep the parentheses intact. This guy is our main operator. So even though, as we said, we could do something with, this negation and then this conditional, it's still attached to this. So in order to touch this, we have to get rid of this. So we worked on 3 and 5. So what can we do? The only things we haven't worked on are 2 and 6, but as I just said, we can't do anything with 2 until we get rid of this disjunction. So let's look at something we've already worked on before, namely this line 5, not P. We have a disjunction on 6, and then we have the negation of the first disjunct right there. Even though we've already worked on 5, so long as it's above what we're doing, we can totally work on it. Or use it to make more inferences. So we have this disjunction, we have the negation of one of its disjuncts. That tells us we can do a disjunctive syllogism on 5 and 6. And that allows us to bring down that conditional. If Q, then R. Alright, so now I've worked on 6, worked on 5 2 times. Still haven't worked on 2, haven't worked on 7. Now, the thing I saw at the very beginning of us solving this problem can now be done. So we have this conditional, then we have the negation of its consequent right up here. That allows us to bring down the negation of the antecedent, the modus tollens on 2 and 7. So yeah, and then our conclusion is that, and we just derived it, so we're done. So yeah, I hope that this was helpful, especially compared to doing it on the computer. Please let me know if you find this to be tremendously more helpful than doing it on the computer. Now that I've figured out how to do this, I think it might be a good way to introduce some of these concepts. But yeah, that's all I have for you today. Please try some of these practice problems on your own. It'll be so important that you get the hang of this by practicing. And yeah, please reach out, please post if you're having trouble. So far, the posts on the discussion board have been excellent, and I think they're really helping everybody involved get a hang of the concepts. I know that things are still a little rough right now, but I'm confident that you guys will get the hang of this by the time the exam comes around. And please note that, especially considering the circumstances, the exam will be adjusted to what I gauge to be your level of competency. So I'll be making a brand new exam that's perfectly suited to where you guys are at. So that being said, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you on Wednesday.